Thank you, and thank you for letting me have this opportunity to talk about the situation in Sweden. And I try to be very brief. I have a tendency to.
I'll keep an eye on the time.
Yeah, I will do that too. Yeah. And then we have the problem with the. Well, in Sweden, we have a focus on child welfare, not child protection. And my Swedish colleagues have promised to add to my presentation if they find that they want to add anything, or if I make some mistakes. There is no permanency planning. In most cases, the parents keep the legal custody of the children throughout the placement, even though they may not have any contact at all. They usually keep the legal custody throughout the placement, which in one way can be a problem. And you have a high focus on maintained contact with the biological family. That's really emphasized in the legislation and in the work that we are supposed to do as social workers. I've been a social worker for almost 20 years, and I've been teaching social workers for almost 20 years, so I'm doing research, so I have experience of all these things. And the placements in care are really seen as temporary solutions, and reunification is the aim according to the legislation. And we all know how difficult that might be, because children in care are taken into care because they have severe problems, not because you have some light problems. And I'm very much in favor of the family-oriented perspective, but I think that if we embrace a family-oriented perspective, we really need to top up our social work accomplishments, because sometimes we all these things are very good, reunification, family perspective, but we don't work enough with the parents, so sometimes the children are going back to the same situations, and nothing has really happened in the placement. If you look at children and young people in care, about 3 to 4% of all 18 years old have had experience of placements in care at some time in their life. I think when I've been in other projects with other countries, around 1% of children has had during a year has care experiences. And Denmark, Sweden, Norway, we usually have higher percentages of children in care, but that's because we don't have youth prisons. Our young offenders are included in the child welfare system. So I think that's why we have a higher proportion of children and young people in care. At the certain date, in October 2012, we had 20,800 children and people in care. About 70% are in foster care. And as you can see, last time I counted, 71% of children in care are 13 years or older, which is also different, I think, to many other countries, because we have a high proportion of teenagers in care, much higher than small children. And when you talk about foster care with people in Sweden, I think what they see in front of them are small children taken into foster care, but it's actually teenagers taken into foster care. One reason that we have such a high proportion is that we have a high amount of unaccompanied asylum-seeking young people. We had a raise of 70% this year, so we have a really high proportion of unaccompanied asylum-seeking young people. And as I said, youth justice is included in child welfare. For mandatory placements, you can stay until 21. You can stay as long as you're 20 until you're 21. And we don't have no Children's Act in Sweden. The government tried to imply a Children's Act, but failed due to municipalities thought that it was too costly. But we have a Social Services Act, that's frame law, and then we have Care of Young People Act for mandatory measures, and then we have also Law of Secure Youth Care. That's part of the Criminal Act, Criminal Code, and it provides an opportunity to incarcerate young offenders within a special units run by the state. And if I try to look at policies, what policies have we implied over the last 3 decades? And you can see that in the 1980s, I was a social worker then, so I remember how we thought about children. Much more focus on small children, neglect and care. But I have gradually changed this to more focus on young people, more focus on young offenders, and also much stricter perception of young people and offending. And I try to look at what is demanded of the court to, because the court can decide that we will not prosecute this young person, we will hand him or her over to the social services. And you could see that more focus on drug and alcohol abuse, stricter attitudes, and more interaction between social services and the courts. And also we had a change of the Care of Young People Act. Grave danger was required for young people to come into care, but now they changed the perception to tangible risk as a requirement for being taken into care. We have, of course, residential homes and foster care, and as I said, 70% are in foster care and around 30% in residential care. But we also have homes for special supervision. That's residential care for criminal and drug abusing youth. And about 30 units in Sweden, and they have facilities for incarcerating young people. And since 1994, it's monitored by a national government agency, the Swedish National Board of Institutional Care. They tried to hand it over to the municipalities in the 70s. It failed completely because the municipalities couldn't handle this task. So it was given back again to the government, to the Swedish National Board, to the state. And local authorities can apply for placement, and they're obliged to pay for the care, and that's very expensive, this care. This Swedish National Board of Institutional Care, it's a government agency that delivers individual care for young people with psychosocial problems and also problems with drug abuse and other things. And it provides care and treatment where voluntary measures have failed. And the orders for compulsory care are made by the administrative court on the application of social services. And most common reasons, that's not a surprise: substance misuse, criminal activity, and disruptive behavior. So most of these young people are placed on an emergency basis, just to break a destructive pattern. And these residential homes can make an assessment of the young people if they think that this is necessary. And the average time in care is 5 months. Many of the young people move on to residential homes or foster homes. And in different research projects over the last years, I have interviewed around 130 young people leaving care. And some of them have been in these residential homes. And what they say is that what they dislike, as some of you mentioned before, that they dislike the uncertainty, that you're not convicted to a certain time, you don't know how long you will stay there, you don't know what will happen to you. And many from these homes, they move on to other foster homes. And this is a law that we introduced in 1996. It's a law of secure youth care, because we don't really have youth prisons in Sweden. You have certain departments in some prisons for younger people, but we don't have any youth prisons. And when you are responsible for criminal acts, the age of that is 15 in Sweden, so until you're 15, you cannot be convicted at all for anything. You will be handed over to the social services and maybe placed in foster care or residential homes, but you cannot be convicted. So young people 15 to 17 years who commit serious crimes, they can, as a measure, have this law of secure youth care. And the actual criminal act is determined on how long time you will spend in this youth care. So not the need for treatment in this case, but the actual criminal act. 14 days to 4 years. So this is in one way better than just being at the residential homes, because you have a time limit to your placement. And the social services are still responsible for these young persons. They are responsible for the care planning, they are responsible for following up the care, and they are responsible for what happens after the care. And as you see, it's rather costly, 8,000 Swedish crowns per day. It's about 700 British pounds per day. And for an example, if foster carers, the general foster care allowance is around 4,000 Swedish crowns a month, maybe 5,000 Swedish crowns a month. So you can see it's a huge difference between what you pay for young people in this type of care and what you would pay for foster carers. And I just, coming here, I looked at a report where this researcher compared secure youth care compared to prisons, and they compared two groups of young people who were taken into prisons before we had that law of secure youth care, and those young people coming into care and in using the secure youth care law. And you can see that secure youth care young people were more often convicted for crimes related to violence and substance abuse. They had a more extensive criminal record than the prison group had a more extensive criminal records. And young people in the secure youth care group, they were convicted at a younger age than the prison group. And also longer average time in care for this group. And this researcher asked the question is if perhaps the courts are taking this placement more likely than a placement in prison, so that you will place young people in this secure youth care more easily than you put them in prison before. And he also looked at relapses, or what would you say, recidivism. Yeah, recidivism. In this report they said that those who had a less restricted time in the youth care were much less likely to come back. But if you had more restricted, if you have a more restricted time, if you tried to escape, if you had more restrictions connected to your placement, much more likely to return to care, to have these relapses of care. And I think that we have too little research on residential care in Sweden. I don't know if you agree, but I think, because when I teach my students, I have to use dissertations from end of the 90s and middle of the 90s, and I wish we would have more research on these issues, because I think they are really important, because for young people this is really could be a life-changing experience. And if you look at the outcomes of this type of care, it's rather dismal. And I've been trying to think about what my young people have told me, and also what I can find in the research that I have read. And what the young people have said is that they become adjusted to the institutional context, not to society, which was not the intention, I think, of the placement. And also risk of contagious contacts. Many of my young people have said that, well, I didn't have these problems before, but meeting all these young people with all these problems with substance abuse and cutting themselves, I learned to do that too, and I felt really bad seeing all these problems. And also, well, this complicated mix of young people with different kinds of problems and lack of effective aftercare. The last 7-8 years, the main part of my research has been on aftercare, on leaving care, transition to adulthood. So I'm rather obsessed by this research. And if you look at the placement outcomes, as I said, rather dismal. Bo Vinjung, who some of you may have met, he had made extensive research on the outcomes of children and young people in care. And you can see for young adults placed in care, elevated risk for suicide attempts, serious psychiatric illnesses, low level of education, and teenage pregnancy. The compensation effect of out-of-home care is rather low. And I also think that what is connected to this is actually the transition to adulthood, because I don't think that we pay enough attention at all to what happens after care. And that was my idea when you talked about your young people in the MTFC system, that you can put all these efforts into the care, and you can put a lot of resources, economical, emotional, whatever resources, and if you don't follow up these resources, you will have problems, and that's not really fair to anyone. Certainly not to the young people, but not also to the foster carers or parents or other people involved in this. So in Sweden, we certainly do not have enough attention on this transition to adulthood, which is something we really should change. And there are, of course, lots of more things to say, and I've tried to speak so quickly that because there's a lot of things to say about youth perspective and the rights perspective of these young people. And participation is one thing that we mention rather too seldom, I think, because the young people that I've talked to who were satisfied with the care, they have been able to participate in decisions, participate in the care planning. So I think that's really an important issue. Oh, thank you.
Well done.